Hello, everyone. Welcome in. We're just going to give it about 1 minute while we wait for folks to trickle in. Always takes about a minute. So just hang on tight. We'll get started shortly. Thank you for those just joining. Just a quick update. We are waiting about 1 minute for everyone to get trickled into the room. So we'll get started here shortly. Just hang on for a second. Okay. Great to see everyone out there today. Have a nice, good, full group here in the webinar. So always nice to see everyone attending. Welcome. Let's go ahead and get started. So today we're going through our Nautobot Navigators webinar series, part 3, circuits, providers, and power distribution. As we look at our agenda for the day, we'll go through some introductions. We're going to talk about circuits and providers, modeling circuits in Nautobot, electrical infrastructure, some example use cases, and then, of course, Q&A. We'll go over at the end any that might not get answered during the webinar. Quick item of housekeeping, please do use the Q&A for asking us questions. That's way we can track those as well as share them with everyone to make sure everyone can see and understand what's been discussed, and we can let everyone know about the questions you might be asking. So please do use the Q&A section as we go through. For those that have not been on webinars with me before, my name is Tim Shryak, and I am the Director of Sales Engineering here at Network Dakota, and I'll be guiding you through the webinar as we are today. We do have some exciting offer here for you for those joining the webinar. This particular offer is available for those on this webinar only, and it is a free 2-hour hands-on Nautobot workshop exclusively for you all. And it will be held actually on May 30th, so it's coming up in just a week, and it's going to focus on Nautobot's various use cases, including its role as a flexible single source of truth for network automation and an extensible data and app platform. It does also have hands-on labs, and it is a kind of an example or an introduction to our standard courses. So a really good way to trial and see what our courses are like. It does have really limited availability, especially since we're only a week out. We do have a few seats left. So if you're interested, please sign up right away. I hate when people tell me later that, oh, I really wanted to go, but I missed the opportunity. So don't wait. If you're interested, please do go and sign up for that as soon as we're done the webinar here today. All right. With that, let's get into looking at circuits and providers relative to how we might look at those in Nautobot. So as we explore in Nautobot, there is a circuits menu option. And this is where we have our maybe new circuits that we might be adding, our circuit types, and provider networks all can be added into Nautobot here from these menu options. As with all things in Nautobot, you can click that little blue plus symbol to add something new in Nautobot if you're doing it through the UI. And then we do also have the circuit maintenance app, as you can see down below there. It can be leveraged to provide additional value. Now, we're not going to go into the details of that app here today, but it is there for you, something that is of interest to you, particularly if you have a large number of circuits and a large number of maintenance notifications coming in from your vendors. This can be very useful. As you can see here is just a quick example of what that maintenance dashboard looks like and the value it can provide to you, particularly if you receive a lot of notifications. Being able to have your tier 1 or your help desk or your NOC have a single place to see all of your maintenance notifications, as well as it handles things like rescheduling or cancellations as well, and can potentially be used to do things like maybe put a circuit in or out of maintenance mode in your monitoring tool automatically. Right, so a lot of value add can come from implementing the circuit maintenance app. But again, we're not going to go into the details here today. We're going to focus on just modeling circuits and providers here in Nautobot. Okay, so here's an example screen of our circuits object list within Nautobot. And we can also add new circuits here, right? So as I was mentioning earlier, of course, as in the menu tree of Nautobot, you can always hit that plus sign on the blue symbol there. Here within any of the screens within Nautobot, you also have that add plus sign available too as well. So just generally speaking, there's usually two places you can go to add something in most screens in Nautobot, and this is no exception. Again, for those of you that may have seen previous videos, you'd be aware of this as well, but it's always good to point out that the columns that you see when you first log into Nautobot may not be all the things you want to see, or perhaps it's too many things and you don't want to see those. So you can adjust that view to your liking by using the configure option up there at the top that will allow you to select the columns that you visualize or not. So if you're not seeing some piece of information that you think you should be, you might need to go under configure and add that. That's a one-time step for your user. You won't ever have to do it again. As well as if there's just too much on the screen, you're like, hey, I don't really care about the description column. I wish that wasn't there. You can go into configure and change that as well. So you have lots of options there how you might be able to be flexible with that. Also really handy, especially when we're talking about circuits, is that export button. This allows you to create a report, basically exporting all of that data in Nautobot, and that can be exported to a CSV file, for example, and now you have a nice, easy way to manipulate that. Perhaps you want to use that in some other format. So a great way to be able to export the data that you see here in the screen. And then finally, the filter button. This is really useful, particularly when you have a large number of circuits. You can filter down by any of the columns that you see here. So perhaps you're looking for a particular provider. You want to see all of your, let's say, NTT circuits, or maybe you want to see all of your circuits that are associated with a particular tenant or a particular business unit or a particular status. Maybe you want to see all the decommissioned circuits or only the active ones. Right? So any way you want to filter that there, you can pull that back and use that filter button to be able to see the options that are useful for you, getting the most value you can out of the data that you're looking at. Because sometimes, especially in large organizations or even mid-sized organizations, there can just be so much data you're trying to filter through it. You really need to be able to have that functionality. So it's there for you. And of course, if you know exactly what you're looking for, you can always just use the search button as well. So type in the basic data there that you're looking for, whether it's something about the provider name or the site, any information there, you can use that search button and drill down as well. So several options for you how you can get to what you're looking for quickly and easily. Okay, so let's actually take a look at our circuit object screen in detail. Uh, and so one of the interesting things I think that really shows the value of Nautobot comes up occasionally on certain views within the Nautobot world. And this is one of those examples. Uh, Typically, you would see circuit information is scattered across different systems, whether that's CMDB, your IPAM, your DSIM, or even some form of the device management inventory. And what you're seeing here on this one screen in Nautobot is the power of a tool that has all of that data in one place. It's now acting as a central hub, consolidating all this data into one easy to consume view. So as you can see here on this example, I've got CMDB data that's highlighted in yellow. I have IPAM data highlighted in green. I've got some DSIM data highlighted in blue, and then I have device-specific information highlighted in red, all consolidated into one easy to consume view. And this is only possible when you have a tool like Nautobot that has all of this data, or at least aggregation of all this data into a single place. And this is one of those times where you say, this really demonstrates the power of a tool like Nautobot. So let's go through some of the fields here that we see. We've got a status field. So we've got some options there. We can have active, decommissioned, planned, provisioning, that you can set those to what makes sense for you in your organization. Basically matching the life cycle of your network. Maybe it's day 0 is your planning phase, day 1 is your provisioning phase, day 2 operations, whatever makes sense. You can accommodate those here. Provider, obviously this is the provider of the network, and it is a clickable link. So we can click on that and head right back over to the provider object where we might get details such as the contact information and support information. So, you're here in, someone in the NOC or the help desk is looking at the circuit. They know there's an issue. They need to call the provider. Just click on the provider name there, pull up that information really easily. Circuit ID. Of course, this is the ID from the vendor. We're going to use this to track the information there about our circuit information. And potentially also, we're using this now to inform our configurations. So as we start to use Nautobot as our source of truth for intended state, we can now have our circuit IDs here, and we can then use that to say, put those in the description fields of our interfaces on our routers and switches automatically. Circuit type field here, populated with our circuit type options. Again, very flexible field. You use this as makes sense in your environment. Tenant. Now, this is something, not all folks are going to use. And this is true across all of Nautobot, this tenant option. This really gives you a way to group your resources by, say, customer, by business unit, by department, kind of what makes sense in your world. Maybe you want to group your circuits. Maybe you're a retail provider and you want to group your circuits by your retail locations versus your corporate office locations, maybe perhaps. So you can use this field as what makes sense for you to help you group your different bits of information into places that are more consumable, as well as potentially you might align those to ways cost centers, for example, as well. The install date field, I think that's pretty self-explanatory, tells us when we activated our circuit. Commit rate can be really useful for setting the minimum guaranteed bandwidth of the circuit, something we track here in the source of truth. And then we can use that in our reports. Potentially, we're aligning that to what we see coming back from our monitoring tool and allowing us to use that to help understand our QoS policies, for example, is another use case, the way that we might make sure we have the correct QoS policy applied to that circuit based on whatever the minimum commit rate is. Description, arbitrary field. You use what makes sense here. Any number of things you might want to put in the description, totally flexible for you. Let's kind of go down to that relationships box there, that green one, tying over, in this case, over to IPAM. This is showing us the list of prefixes used by this circuit or assigned to this circuit here in Nautobot. You can also potentially have custom relationships within Nautobot or extensible relationships. This is a way in which you can make Nautobot really adapt to your environment. That is by creating those custom relationships. And if you did have any, they would show up here. So you're able to understand some unique situation you have in your environment, and you want to model that into the data that would be expressed here under the relationships box. Tags. Now, tags are simultaneously the most amazing thing and possibly the worst thing you could ever use in any form of database. And the reason I say that is, right, it gives you a lot of flexibility, which is really powerful, but with great power, you need to be responsible. So be careful with this field. It does have a lot of power, though, because you can create any user-defined information you want here that can help you quickly sort and identify fields. The only thing you want to be careful on is that you don't create too many and that you make sure they're consistent. Sometimes what happens is somebody creates a tag and they capitalize it. Someone else creates the same tag, but they don't capitalize it, for example, right? So we want to be careful about that in who creates tags and that we make sure they're consistent. And that's just generally true across any tool, but just always want to highlight that here. You do have great power, but be careful with it. Termination sides, right? So here we're looking at the termination of the circuit. Circuits, by definition, are connected to another device or devices. And this field allows us to describe those termination points. Now, in Nautobot, some circuits may only have a single termination point listed if you don't care about the other side. A good example of that is circuits provided by some carrier. So you only care about, let's say on your internet, your DIA circuits, if you are an enterprise, you really only care about the side of the circuit that's connected to your router. You don't really have any information or even care about where it is connected over on the provider side of the network. And so in that scenario, you probably would only have one termination point expressed in Nautobot as an example. And then we move down to the circuit maintenance section here. And just a quick highlight of it as well. As we saw that previous screen where we saw that full summary of all circuit maintenances, if you're using the circuit maintenance app, you would also see maintenances relative to this circuit only here on this particular view. And again, you're only going to see this if you have installed and are using the circuit maintenance app. If you haven't installed it, then this will not appear on your screen. Finally, there is the contacts tab, right? And this is where we're able to understand who are the associated contacts with this circuit. Perhaps maybe it's someone on site. Maybe it's in a branch office and it's the local office manager or someone that you just want to be able to contact relative to that circuit. So you have that flexibility there for you as well. Okay, That was a pretty deep view into our circuits objects screen there. So hopefully that's helpful for you. Kind of explain all of that data that you're seeing there, because it is a lot of data presented in a single view. So it can be particularly useful and powerful from that sense. Okay, let's talk a little bit about our circuit types. So we have some options that we see here. And again, this is something flexible. You can use this as to what makes sense in your environment. You can see you have that add option there for you. So you can add these and make them however makes sense in the types of circuits you're using. So here we just have some examples, things you might put, dark fiber, transit circuits, MPLS circuit, any number that you might have here. But here we're just seeing a nice consolidated view of how many we have in our environment, as well as just a list of those types. So kind of drilling into a specific example here, we're going to look at the transit example. Again, each of these types is user defined, which gives you the opportunity to model your environment into the data. This is a key thing that we want to express about Nautobot, and it's true across the platform in general, which is that we are not trying to force you to adapt your world to the tool. We want the tool to be adaptable and extensible to match what you need. So here's a perfect example. There's particular options for circuit types. You make it for what you need. Description, again, custom string field, you put whatever you want there. And then we have some information provided. So number of transit type circuits that have been identified here in Nautobot. In this case, we have 140 of them. And then we can see that list. So we can drill into that particular list here as we're looking at all of the circuits that are of type transit that are currently modeled in this instance of Nautobot. And then similar as we move over to the provider. Right, we have our list of providers. We can see a little bit of information about them, our ASN, our account number, if we have populated that with that particular provider, can be really useful. Potentially, sometimes you might have multiple account numbers. You can also have that option for you there as well. So modeling out all of our providers and all of our information that we need about them, wherever we are in the world. And so that's kind of a key thing to remember here, that again, Nautobot being very flexible, we can model and match to our providers as they may be across the world, as there are some nuances if you're using a US-based provider versus an EMEA-based provider versus Asia-Pac, et cetera. We have that ability to be flexible, make sure we can model your environment. Drilling into the details of the provider object, again, we've got the ASN, we've got our account number. Here you can see, some links to the customer portal information. Really, really useful for those that are in charge of managing the circuits, working with the providers, contacting them when there's a problem. We have all of that details right here for you. So an easy, consolidated place to see not only information about the circuits, but also who do I contact when there's a problem. Or who do I contact maybe when there's a billing problem versus a technical problem, right? So you have that not content versus the admin contact, right? So you have those options there for how you might need to reach out to them and the data that you might need to store about them. And again, always to highlight Nautobot being very, very flexible. Perhaps there's some other field that you want to store about your providers that's not here. You absolutely can use a custom field in Nautobot to go ahead and add that, right? So you have a lot of flexibility to make sure you can make Nautobot do what you need it to do and make sure it's representing your world accurately. And then here, again, that circuit list, right? So now we can see all of the circuits relevant to the provider. So we have those options for us, whether it's circuit type, just all the circuits by the provider, et cetera, right? So any number of filtering views that we might see here. So we're going to take a little shift now after kind of that overview of looking at how the model circuits are modeled in Nautobot. Now let's take a look at like what you would actually do to go start adding circuits into Nautobot. We'll go through a quick overview of this and actually look at some of the details as well. So first thing we're going to do is start off over on the circuits menu over there on the left-hand side. Or if we're already in the circuits option, maybe we're in the right-hand side and we're clicking on the add button. But either way, we're going to click on the add button to add a new circuit. And that will bring up the add a new circuit screen for us, as we can see here. We're going to fill out the required fields, which are the provider, the circuit ID, the circuit type, and the status. So you can see those all bolded there, the names of those fields, so you know that those are required fields. And so we're going to have to put those in. The rest of the information is optional. You choose whether or not you want to populate that. So we're going to click the add button. We're going to put in the required fields, potentially optionally add in anything extra, and then finally click create. So that's the basic steps as we move through of what's required to go ahead and add a circuit. But now that's cool. We've got a circuit in there, but now we want to start to model what it actually looks like. We want to be able to represent its path. We want to show what devices it's connected to, for example. So first, we're going to start off with associating the locations with that circuit. So after we've clicked create, we're going to navigate to the circuit itself. So you can see here, now we've drilled into that particular circuit, and we're going to click the add button for termination of the A side. And this is a key part as we kind of walk through this. These are important steps that we want to follow in order. So do take a note here as you're practicing. If you get stuck on this, always feel free to come back to the recording of the video. It will be helpful for you as well. Then we're going to associate the continuing of that location. Now we're going to drill into the add location button. And then we are going to select one of the two termination locations for the circuit. So that we're going to choose from that drop down there. And in this case, we're saying it's going from network to code to our Jersey City location. Now we will potentially fill out any of those optional fields. Those are the termination details there, like port speed, upstream speed, those things. Choose those if you wish or not. And then click create. We will then repeat this process for the second termination point, assuming this particular circuit has two termination points. So if you are doing some form of dark fiber or maybe an MPLS circuit that you're modeling, you might have two termination points. If you were doing a DIA, internet-based circuit, maybe you wouldn't do the second location because you don't care about the second termination point. Now we're going to assign out our prefix for the particular circuit. So we're going to our, next to the plus button on our prefixes section, we will go ahead and add in the required fields for a prefix. So whatever prefix has been assigned to us either by the provider or that we have self-selected if it's our own IP space, the namespace, the type, and the status. Again, all of those bolded fields required, the optional fields you choose, whether you want them or not, and then click create. Now we're going to add in the IP addresses for those termination points. And this is a bit tedious as we go through, but don't worry, it's not that long, it's not that hard. It's just kind of learning to make sure you do these things in the right order. As we look in that prefix, now we see, because we have a /30, it's going to tell us, hey, there's two IPs available, which makes sense because we're assigning these on either end of the circuit. So we're going to go ahead and click on IP addresses and then finally click on number of IPs available. You can actually click on that link there, and it's going to help us then go ahead and create those IPs for the termination points. So again, we're going to fill in the required fields. It is going to auto-populate the address there by selecting the first one available out of that subnet. You could change that if you want. You need to assign the namespace, the namespace is going to already be assigned by the prefix, type, and status as well. Then we're going ahead and add the optional fields and then click create. You then repeat this process for the second termination point, right? Because we're assigning out two IPs, right? So we're going to make sure we get those two IPs added in, which would be pretty simple to do here. After that, now we're going to say, just for chat's example, right? We're going to say, we're assuming that we're connecting our New Jersey location to our New York City location. So we're going to navigate to the device that terminates the connection. So here, in this case, we went to our Jersey City backbone router, as you can see there in the number 1, and we're going to click on the plus button for the interface that we're terminating the circuit to. We're going to assign the IP that we just defined previously under the prefix that is appropriate for this router. So we can just do a quick search. That's the easiest way to add the one that we want, is go ahead and click on the assign IP. Then in the search box, enter in that IP for this particular router or switch, search, and then select that IP assigned to this interface. Again, repeat the process for the other side. Right? So 2 steps along the way here because we do have 2 termination points. Now we're going to actually make that connection in Nautobot, just like you would in the real world, where you're plugging the cable into one end and into some other end of whatever it may be. So here we're going to, again, we're starting off in the device. We're going to click into the interface and we're going to click on that connect cable icon there. It's the third one over from the right, there that has that little connect cable symbol. And we're going to choose the circuit termination option from the dropdown that will appear. Once we go into that cable, now we're going to actually create this connection. So we're going to fill out the required fields, which would be the circuit, the side, and the status. So filling in those fields, any optional ones we can select as well, of course, as always, and then we click connect. Now, we did all that work for a really interesting reason, really, really useful and flexible reason, is because now we see an amazing cable trace that looks like this, or circuit trace to be more specific, where we can actually see the end-to-end path and understand how our particular circuit is cabled and connected. A really great form of documentation that is usable and useful. And particularly if you have a large number of circuits, sometimes this can be really difficult to understand. Or for example, when I was an engineer and would often be troubleshooting issues, it was not uncommon where you find, hey, there's an outage somewhere because someone accidentally disconnected a circuit. Especially in your branch office locations or your small office locations, somebody kicked the router or kicked a wire and the wire got pulled out and nobody really knows where it goes. Traditionally, what we often do is end up just plug and play, and we keep trying until it works. Here we have that documented. We can actually tell the person on the other end of the phone, hey, plug that cable into the gig 1 interface on that router. That's where it goes. We know where it goes. It's a really, really useful, really powerful to have this documented so we actually understand how our environment is connected and is functioning. Just a quick note here. We did manipulate this image a bit here so that it would work nicely on the slide. It does represent slightly differently in Nautobot. All the content is exactly the same, just we made it so that it showed up nicely here for you during the webinar. Okay. Also highlighting as well the demarcation points that you see here. That's where we actually are connecting our cables as we went through that story. So it helps us really understand the full picture of our path end to end. So that finishes up our dive into circuits, circuit objects, as well as a quick overview of circuit maintenance and its possible options for you as well. Let's pivot a bit and talk about electrical infrastructure that we have, particularly in our data centers is the primary target here. In large branch offices, you might also see some of this examples, but primarily you might see this in a data center. We're going to look at how we think about power in the world. For those of you maybe perhaps don't work particularly in the data center, just a quick explanation that will help this make sense. Typically, what we see is that we have two panels feeding power into our environment. We have our A side and our B side, sometimes referred to as primary and secondary, or A and B, depending on the data center or your standards. And yeah, each of our devices is typically connected in some way to the A side and the B side. So we're basically making sure we're able to take this real world scenario, which is that we feed feed power from our panels into our PDUs, and then our PDUs in turn feed power to our devices. We're able to then take that concept and make sure that we can represent this here in Nautobot. So just to clarify, those top bits, right, coming from the panel to the feed are managed from the power menu within Nautobot. From the PDU to the device is managed from the device menu. So just to help make sure you understand those components and where you would represent those are where you would go as you're trying to model those in Nautobot. So you can model that full path just in two slightly separate sections within the Nautobot world. So as we look at our power feeds, here you can see we're in the power section of the menu tree over the left-hand side of Nautobot, and we have two options. We have power feeds and power bends. Here we're looking at the feeds, and we can see, again, all of those menu column choices for us with details about the feeds that we have from our data center provider. A name for the feed, the power panel that it's connected to, the rack that it's feeding, its status, the type, supply, voltage, amperage, phase, cable peer, all of those details, right, that we would have as we are cabling up the power side of our world. So all of those things that you might need. And again, to reiterate, if there was for some reason, some unusual thing you have in your world and you said, hey, I need to model this field, we can always add that as well using a Nautobot custom field. So a lot of flexibility here. Okay, let's actually go into the details and kind of drill into the feed object. So this is representing the distribution of power from a panel to a particular device, usually a PDU, which then is in turn connected to the end devices, as we saw on the earlier screen. So here we're modeling what that power panel is. Or with this feed, the associated power panel it's connected to. And we are only tracking the fact that that connection exists. We're not actually tracking that cable that goes from the panel to the feed, because typically that's something provided to us by the data center provider and isn't something that we manage most of the time. Now, if you are a data center provider, this is something that we could then additionally model in Nautobot. So if that was a requirement for you, it is something that could be modeled, but for most users of Nautobot, that's not something we need to model. The rack. So this is the rack where we're sending the power feed to. And this is an optional field because it's not always applicable. So if it makes sense, you use it. If you don't need it, then do not use it. Under the type, here, this intended state for this field here is whether it's our primary or redundant, our A or B side that we wouldn't be modeling here, as we look at our data, our power. Sorry, keep confusing data with power. Now, the utilization field. This is something to make sure we understand. This is a representation of the calculation based on the rack's utilization, which is in turn calculated on the device power consumption. And the important thing to remember here is this is our planned power consumption. This is not representative of actual power consumption at any given point in time. That would be something that we would have in our monitoring tools. Here on the Nautobot side, we're expressing intended state or expected state, or in this case, planned allocated state. So this is as we model out our racks and our devices and we add all of that up and we spend our power budget, we want to make sure we're not exceeding it. That's what we're doing here. So we're making sure you can easily understand how much power is planned for a given rack, and you can make sure you don't exceed your power budget within that rack. This could also potentially be used for when you're looking at a rack and you're thinking, wait, why is it planned for so much power? And perhaps it's because we've got some decommissioned devices in there that we meant to disconnect. It could help us identify those. And then it also helps us make sure we're balancing our plan to power budget, making sure we're not drawing too little for the rack and that we're not drawing too much. So giving us that view. Now, under electrical characteristics, of course, here we're just modeling the physical characteristics of the actual feed, whether it's AC or DC, single phase or three phase. And then, of course, it's max draw or it's max utilization that we might be able to pull across that circuit or circuit that we expect to pull, right? Like we don't want to exceed, let's say 80%, right, in this case. And then the connection side. So similar to what we saw over on the circuits, this allows us to model how we actually have this cabled. And you will notice that little cable trace blue button there next to the cable number. So that allows us to actually see and visualize what that connection looks like and where it goes from point A to point B. Device, this is the device that it's actually connected to. So the PDU that we're sending that feed into, the port it's connected to on the PDU, and then what the status is this expected to be reachable or whatever. Again, you use these fields as makes sense in your work. Okay, covering the power feed. So now let's look at our power panel list. Here we have our power panels, our name, location, the rack group that they may be associated with, how many feeds are coming out of them, and then any tags. So pretty simple view here from the panel side, not a lot to model in this sense. As we drill into the object, I think the most interesting thing we see here is both the location, so we can see and look at all of our power panels relative to our sites, usually the way we're looking at that. And then we can also see those relative to our rack groups. It's optional, so you choose whether or not you want to do that. And then all of the associated feeds under that panel. So one consistent place to see all of that data as you're feeding power into your environment. So that concludes our review of the electrical modeling within Nautobot. So let's take a look at some example use cases of how we can think about how we might use these stories that we're now able to use in the data and actually start to render real business value and real value to the technical team as well. So here's an example of how we can use the data we have in Nautobot to verify our circuit connections. So once we've got that data populated and the relationships established, we can now leverage the Nautobot's capability to create configuration contexts to understand what our intended configuration should look like. So here you see an example rendering of some interface configuration for gig 00. And you can see there, we've rendered out what we expect or what we want that configuration to look like. And we did that by pulling in the description information, the circuit ID, because we've modeled that here in Nautobot. And then we took advantage of the fact that we also know about the circuit's bandwidth expectations. And therefore, we automatically assigned the appropriate QoS policy here in the interface modeling, or in the desired interface configuration. So we're leveraging a few things here. We're leveraging Nautobot's capability to model your circuit information and all of the relevant data about that. We're also leveraging Nautobot's Golden Config app and configuration context to then render configuration state for a given device. And we're merging those two things together with some code that allows us to say, hey, because this circuit is of a 10 gig circuit, we're going to apply the appropriate 10 gig QoS policy. This makes sure that we have the correct policy applied to a given device or given circuit. We don't have to worry about a human accidentally applying the wrong one. Or perhaps at some point, we go and we update that circuit, we upgrade it. Maybe we started off at a 100 meg circuit and we upgraded it to a 10 gig. And maybe the engineer forgot to update the QoS policy correspondingly. And so we spent all this money on a 10 gig circuit and we're not getting the advantage of it. This way, we get automatically notified, hey, we updated that data in Nautobot from a 100 meg to a 10 gig circuit, and now it's going to render the appropriate configuration. If we're using Nautobot to auto-deploy config, that's going to happen automatically. Or if we're not using it to deploy, but just to report, we will see a report that will flag the fact that that router out in the real world is not in line with its expected state, and someone can go investigate and correct that. So multiple ways we might take a look at this, but a really great way to see the leveraging of data in Nautobot and actually making use of it in the real world. And I think that's one of really the key things to understand about Nautobot is that it's not just about documenting data. It's how do we actually drive the life of an everyday engineer, the business and the technical folks, that we can actually have real value coming back to us from this data. Data is no longer just about documentation. Data is how we actually manage the environment. And that is a really critical point about Nautobot in general. Okay, reducing some of our spend, right? So how can we use Nautobot and the data we've stored to help us reduce our OpEx? Here's one way. So we've got our list of circuits stored in Nautobot. We've got our list of circuits coming from the provider, maybe from the bill or the invoice, or maybe they provide an API where you can pull this, or they give it to you in a spreadsheet. Any number of ways you might get it in some electronic format. But now we have these two bits of information. And we can use Nautobot to compare this data and give us a list of circuits that are retirable. Let's say, hey, this circuit is no longer in use, or we forgot that it was still connected. We didn't realize we were still paying the bill. Any number of cases. This happens a lot in the real world. In fact, we have worked with a very large client of ours that has thousands of circuits, and they actually discovered and saved millions of dollars in circuit spend because they were able to find unused circuits in their environment. So this can be a really interesting space, particularly if you have a large number of circuits in your environment. A really great use case, again, of how we use data to actually drive the environment, not just for purposes of documentation. Another use case, reducing our colocation costs, finding and consolidating underutilized racks. So because we are modeling the points in the data center, we can understand, and we have all of that power information. We can look at both the empty rack space as well as our allocated power budgets and understand where can we consolidate? Can we consolidate? And this is often something really difficult to do in the real world because of those two problems. One, we need to understand where I have free units in the racks, and I need to understand my power budget. And usually that information is in different tools. One's in potentially in my DSIM tool, another might be in my CMDB or my inventory tool, and they're not together. Now, because we have this data in one place, it's easy to understand, hey, I have free units in this rack, and it also has free power budget. I could actually start to consolidate, and maybe I can free up some footprint, save me some money in my data center. Or even better, maybe I don't reduce my spend, but I don't have to increase my spend. I need to add some new devices. I can perhaps consolidate a few into rack A and install the new devices in rack B. Another great example, right, of being able to now expand into my existing footprint without having to, say, go buy another tile from the data center. So a great way to be able to merge that information and actually use it. Again, all this idea of using data, not for purposes of documentation, but for how I actually make decisions and manage my environment. All right. So we're getting into our Q&A section. Let's see if we have any questions coming in from folks here out in the world, as you are all out there. Please do feel free to fire any into the Q&A as you are listening here throughout the talk. If you've got any questions for me, happy to answer those and go over those as well. So a few things you may want to consider, perhaps, we've just got one coming in now. Can circuit information from other IT management systems be brought into Nautobot programmatically? So great question. Thanks for that one. Again, this is what Nautobot's purpose in life is to make your life easier. So the answer to the question directly is yes. We can use any number of, there's several methods by which we can get data from other tools into Nautobot. The best way, we believe, is to leverage the Nautobot single source of truth application. It's one of our apps available as part of the Nautobot app ecosystem, and it lets you synchronize data to or from Nautobot from any other tool, so long as that other tool has an API. So basically, we can synchronize data in or out of Nautobot via the API of that other tool. There are other methods by which you might get data into Nautobot as well. You could use a Nautobot job. You could use the Nautobot API endpoint if you wanted to push data from the other side. Any examples there, but really, really flexible in how we can ingest data into Nautobot to model our world. Right. So there's that one. Got another question coming in here. How are you handling the problem where some circuits may be terminated at a provider device, like one-to-N models, for example, for an IP VPN? Yeah, so that was what we covered actually early on in the discussion. And that was the idea where some circuits will only have a single termination point. So you choose whether you're having a single termination point, which is the example you provided there. Hey, I don't care about the other side. I only have my side, the A side, or I might model both sides of the circuit if I'm in charge of the routers or the endpoints on either side of that circuit. So absolutely, you can model both of those use cases, and that's just by how many termination points you connect to the circuit. Is it possible, I got another one coming in here. Is it possible to automatically open carrier tickets? Can you talk about that for a minute? So yes, short answer. Longer answer. What this is, as we start to evolve in maturity within our environment, and we're actually linking the idea of Nautobot in with our monitoring tool. A perfect example would be of this. Perhaps our monitoring tool is picking up on BGP flaps occurring on a particular circuit. And we want to take that information, maybe take a little snapshot, maybe gather some data, do a ping test or some other form of test that we might have, collect that data, and then open a ticket with the provider. That absolutely can be done within Nautobot, leveraging the Nautobot job system, where we can embed that logic, that custom business logic that says, hey, here are the unit tests that I would like to do before I open the ticket, and then access the provider via API, ideally, if they have one, in which case we can open that ticket with them. Or worst case, we could generate an email via a template and send that email off to the provider to open the ticket as well. So absolutely possible to model, to deal with circuit information and then map that from our monitoring tool and then provide a response, automatically open tickets, for example. Be a great way. Let's see, one more question here coming in. Well, you're all firing them away at me here as we come into the end, so thank you. How would a Nautobot user be notified if an interface correction was incorrect? So this was kind of talking about that use case that we were looking at where we saw that, hey, the QoS should have been 10 gig, but it was still at 100 meg, for example. How does that actually work? So we are leveraging the Nautobot Golden Config app, which allows us to produce a configuration compliance mechanism. So first step is that we're rendering the intended state within Nautobot. So we do that using a combination of the configuration context capabilities of Nautobot, our vendor syntax, which we store in a template, which will be over in GitHub. Nautobot is going to merge those two pieces of information, the data about the device, the template for that particular type of device, and produce an intended state for the configuration. The Nautobot Golden Config app is then going to take that piece of information, compare it to the actual state of the device, and give us a report. That's a quick overview of the Golden Config app. That's something that potentially of interest to you. Please do reach out. We'd love to give you a demo of that, explain how that works. You can also find it over in the GitHub repo under Nautobot and the Golden Config application. All right. I think we've answered quite a few questions. I don't see any others coming in here at the moment, so thanks for those. Just a quick overview as we look at the end here of the webinar today. We looked at how we can use Nautobot to help us reduce costs. And we went over 3 examples that this Nautobot can be really powerful. Whether it is doing something like looking for unused circuits in my environment, potentially looking for unused rack units and consolidating that into a single rack, saving us money in our data center. Or looking across the environment holistically about our power consumption. So several use cases by which we can use Nautobot to help us in a practical real-world sense. Okay, don't forget as well, there is a guided sandbox companion video that goes with today's webinar. You'll get to see me there as well. So hopefully you enjoy listening to me, and hopefully I can give you some value add. This is a great video, goes into the really details of how you would go through and model your circuits and your electrical connections within Nautobot, even a little bit deeper than we did today. Also covering some topics about how we get data into Nautobot, and as well as our upcoming video series, where we'll be talking about our network importer, device data synchronization and normalization within systems of record, kind of addressing some of those questions we got there at the end. There's a link to the video in the chat there for you. So if you're interested, please do check that out as well. And don't forget, the complimentary 2-hour hands-on Nautobot workshop. If you didn't already go and sign up and you want to, please do. There are only a couple seats left, or at least there were at the beginning of this webinar. They may already be gone by now. So if you're interested, please do use the link and go ahead and sign up here as soon as possible. And finally, our Nautobot courses. With those of you here in attendance today, we do have a 15% off code. You can use those for our public courses. We do have one coming up, Creating Nautobot Apps. This is a pretty detailed course all about how you can really leverage the power of the Nautobot app ecosystem to be able to do things and express your business logic in a way that is very difficult to do in any other tool. So great course here for you. It's a 2-day course coming up in August. Thanks for attending. Here's some links for you for all things Nautobot, the Nautobot ecosystem, our apps, our documentation, Nautobot Cloud, of course, there. If you want the easy button and you want to be able to just access Nautobot and not have to worry about operating in your environment, we have that full SaaS offer for you. And please do reach out for a demo. We just dropped a link in there for you if you would like to set up a demo. It's a really easy way to contact us, get time to do that. So look forward to seeing you on the next webinar. Please watch the sandbox video. So long.